Welcome to the Master Thesis Track. My name is Hans. I'm the former Master Thesis Coordinator. These days Stefan is the Master Thesis Coordinator, so if you have any questions, ask him those questions, not me. I will explain though the procedures for the Master Thesis Track and for the thesis itself. The Master Thesis Track is this mini course. What you have to do is to write a summary assignment and fill out a thesis registration form and have that signed by the supervisor and the second reader. If you do that, if you pass the summary assignment and if you fill out the thesis registration form and have that signed by those two tutors, you will pass this mini course, and then you can go on in the next semester to write your thesis. I will explain all the ins and outs of the procedure. There are lots of rules and regulations here, a lot of deadlines, so you have to take care of those deadlines yourself. You have to be aware of them, so also take a look at the manual and the time schedule on Canvas. You have to watch this clip prior to the first meeting you have with Stefan. That also means that you have to come up with a supervisor and a topic before that first meeting. I will explain at the end of this clip what you have to do for that and to see how supervisors are allocated. In this clip I will first explain the procedure of the Master Thesis Track, so the mini course, and the thesis itself. There are a lot of procedures, there are a lot of steps, there are a lot of ways you can divert from the regular track. There is a flowchart. That flowchart is also in the manual. The manual can be found on Canvas, so you can find all the details there. There will also be a time schedule on Canvas. And in the time schedule you'll see all the deadlines. What I'll do is also explain the deadlines of the procedure in a general way, so not with the specific deadlines for you. So those are on Canvas. Then I will take a look at how a thesis is assessed, what is required for the thesis registration form, and finally how you choose a topic and find a supervisor. In the first part of this recording I will explain the procedure for this course and for the writing and assessment of your thesis. There are strict deadlines for many steps along the way of writing a thesis, to go on to plan and then actually write the thesis. So make sure you have a good planning, a tight planning. Discuss this planning with your supervisor, so maybe even put some extra deadlines on the thesis registration form for deadlines, for instance, for when you hand in first drafts of chapters. You could do that. So make sure you make a good planning. If you have problems with that, discuss this with your supervisor. Also note that your thesis is not your life achievement. Sometimes students think, after this I won't be doing any philosophy anymore, so this is the book, the philosophy book I will write in my lifetime. Well, it's just 2 papers basically. So you get 12 EC for the actual thesis, which means that it's basically 2 courses. That's not an entire book. So see it as a large paper, as an academic test. If you do that, you can keep it more feasible. You don't run the risk of making the project too big and that your supervisor has to say, well, this is a nice plan, but this is going to be 2 books or 1 book even. So keep it feasible and limited.
So you don't have much time. It might look like a lot, but it isn't. And this means that it's also smart to come up with a topic that you already know something about. So something that fits the track you're doing, for instance. Sometimes students choose a topic that would better suit a different track, which means that they have to do a lot of work to get up to speed with the basic literature, the basic ideas in that field. So try to keep it within your own expertise. In a moment, we'll look at the procedure using a flow chart on different PowerPoint slides. This flowchart is also in the manual. What you can do is you can start this entire project in any semester. So you can start it in the first semester, then you start in block 2 with the mini course and you write the thesis immediately after that in the second semester, or you start in block 4 of semester 2 and then you can write your thesis in the first semester of next academic year. To be clear, Stefan is the Master Thesis Coordinator, which means that he does all the admin concerning this mini course and also for the thesis. If you have questions about the procedures and stuff like that, you can ask him. Do this via the Master Thesis email address. He, of course, is not your supervisor. It could be, he will supervise several theses, of course, but the person that supervises your thesis is your supervisor. The second person that will grade your thesis is the second reader. You do not contact the second reader about your thesis. You do not send them your initial drafts of your chapters. The second reader gets the final version of your thesis. Then together, the supervisor and the second reader are the tutors, and the track coordinator is the person in charge of the specific master track. So there will be there is a track coordinator for the PMP track and for the ABO track, for instance. To begin with, you participate in the mini course, in the Master Thesis Track course for 3 EC. You get those 3 EC if you pass the summary assignment and you pass the thesis registration form. I'll go back to that in a moment. There are a lot of deadlines. They will be posted on Canvas, those specific deadlines for your mini course, for your Master Thesis Track course. The first thing you need to do is to fill out the supervisor preference form when it has been made available. So that will be available on Canvas. What you do there is you fill out your preferred supervisor and a topic. Then you might say, well, I might also want to write on another topic. So you look for a supervisor for that. That's the second preference, and you fill out the topic and you do that also for a third supervisor. Could of course be the case that you just fill out 3 different supervisors that could supervise that topic, making it more probable that you can write about that topic. So what we can tell you is that not everyone will be able to write on the topic they want or have the supervisor they want. Some supervisors and some topics are very popular, and those supervisors cannot just do all those theses. I'll get back to that at the end of this clip. Now, once you have filled out the supervisor preference form, then all the supervisors look at that form, fill out their names, and we'll allocate the different theses to the supervisors or the other way around, depending on how you look at it. And then the supervisor contacts the students and a first meeting will be scheduled. And then you basically go to step 2. Once you decided on the topic, you have to do a summary assignment. This is part of the exam for this Master Thesis Track mini course. So there will be a deadline and there will be a reset for that. What you have to do is you get the title of a paper from your supervisor. You have to read the paper, summarize it, and reflect on it, critically reflect on it. The details of this assignment will be posted on Canvas. And then you get a fail or a pass. Now, if you miss the deadline the first time or you failed the first time, you do continue to the next step and you just do the reset. If you then again fail the reset or miss the deadline, then you have to redo this mini course next semester. So you basically fail the course, and also you cannot start writing your thesis in the next semester. Your supervisor is the one that grades the summary assignment. The next step is filling out the thesis registration form. The details of that I'll discuss in a moment. Basically, it is a plan for your thesis. It contains your research questions, some literature, an overview of the different chapters. So you fill that out on that. Also, you could add a time schedule for when you hand in different chapters. So discuss that with your supervisor. So what you do is you discuss, of course, the topic with your supervisor, discuss whether the plan you have is not too big, so you come up with an initial plan. Your supervisor might say, well, if you do this, that's 3 books, so try to make it feasible, just discuss this topic. So once you have found some consensus about that, the supervisor will contact the second reader. They will take a look at the plan, and if they agree, then everybody signs the thesis registration form. You fill it out, you sign it, and you submit it. This is basically the second part of the exam of this mini course. The first part is the summary assignment. You have to pass that. And the second one is the thesis registration form. If you submit this signed thesis registration form before the deadline, then you have passed that part of the exam. If not, then there will be a deadline for the resit. If you miss that, it's just like with the summary assignment, you will have to redo the mini course next semester. If you submit it before the deadline, the first one or the second one, then you have completed the Thesis Track Master course and you get your 3 EC. They will remain in Osiris even if you maybe failed to write a master thesis the semester after you passed this mini course. The next step is the go, no-go moment. The date is on Canvas. This is at the very beginning of the next semester, that is once you just started writing your thesis. This go, no-go moment is you get the go or a no-go from your supervisor. Of course, they have to base that evaluation on something, so you have to hand in maybe a first draft of a first chapter or part of a chapter, so they have something to go on and see whether they think you will manage to write a master thesis in the time that is allocated for that. If they say there's a go, then the supervisor fills out the form and sends it to the master thesis email address, and you continue writing and you go to the next step. If the supervisor gives you a no-go, then they also send the form to the email address of the master thesis. And that always means you should find a new supervisor. It could be in two ways. The first one is that you just find a new supervisor for the thesis you are writing on. Of course, that will be difficult, but the master thesis coordinator will try to do his best to find a new supervisor for you, but maybe they will also say, well, given what I've seen here so far, I also think that the student will not write a sufficient thesis on this topic in the amount of time that is that's available for the student. That could just mean that you have to start all over again, even in the next semester, and that will also then mean that you have to write on a different topic. Okay, so make sure that you hand in some quality work that the supervisor can use to evaluate your process in the go, no-go meeting. Okay, most students get the go and then they continue writing. Now, the next step is handing in the thesis. Of course, there's a couple of months between step 4 and step 5, the go, no-go meeting and handing in the thesis. You will get feedback from your supervisor on all the chapters. You will rewrite those chapters based on the feedback, and then in the end, you hand in a thesis. You do that in the plagiarism scanner on the Canvas page of the mini course you're doing. And then you'll send an email to your supervisor and the second reader and you say, I've handed in my thesis in the plagiarism scanner. That way, you have a record of handing it in the plagiarism scanner. We all are looking at the same thesis, so students cannot hand in something in, say an empty document in the plagiarism scanner and then send the thesis via email to the supervisor and the second reader, so that the plagiarism scanner then says 0% plagiarism, and then you could hand in a thesis that is in which you plagiarized. So that's why we do this. So hand it in the plagiarism scanner, and the supervisor and second reader download the thesis from there. If you did this by the deadline, then they will assess it, fill out the individual assessment form, and send that to the master thesis coordinator. If you did not hand in the thesis before the deadline, you automatically, of course, go for the resit. It's an exam, there will be a resit. I'll say something more about that in a moment. So if you handed it in before the deadline, then your supervisor and the second reader, so the tutors, will assess it. Now it becomes difficult. So there are many different possibilities when grading a thesis. Depending on those differences, there are also different routes. So let's look at them and see what happens. So if both give a sufficient grade or both give an insufficient grade, then they could either agree or disagree on the provisional mark. Now, if they agree, if they both give you, for instance, an insufficient grade, then they obviously agree, then it's 5 or lower, then you have to do a resit. I think that makes sense, right? If both tutors say this is not a sufficient thesis, you have to do the resit. They could also agree that it's a 6. So it is sufficient, but not a very high grade. To make sure you do not get a pity 6, so that your supervisor and the second reader say, well, this is a very nice student, it's not the best thesis, so let's give him a 6, then a third reader is needed. If the third reader says that it's not sufficient, then you have to do the reset. So the third reader then decides. If the third reader also says that it's a 6, then you get this provisional grade. In this case, thus it is a 6, and you're asked if you're satisfied with the grade. If so, you can go on to the defense, that's step 7, or if not, you can do the reset. Just like with any exam, you are allowed to do a reset. Okay, so they could also agree, of course, that it's 6.5 or higher. Then again, you get this provisional grade, and you can decide whether you do the reset for a higher grade or you're satisfied with the grade and go to the defense. Now, if they both give you a sufficient grade, then they could also disagree on how good it is. Now, if there's a minor difference, so they both give a sufficient grade, but the difference is less than a point, and they cannot agree so they can talk about it and they can come to an agreement, right? So if your supervisor says it's an 8 and the second reader says it's a 6, then you might say, okay, well, what are we going to do? They can come up. So the supervisor might say, well, the student, it's very original, it's a very original topic, and the student did all the work on their own. They could argue for a grade that is, for instance, a 7, but could also be a 7.5, for instance, that the second reader says, okay, in that case, I'm inclined to give a higher grade than my initial assessment was. If they do not agree, so if one says, in this case, if someone says it's a 6 and the other says it's a 7, and they say, well, no, I'm sticking to the 6, and the other says, no, I'm sticking to the 7, then they have to average, and then it will be 6.5 or higher, and then the same procedure is followed. You get your provisional grade and you can decide whether you do a reset or you go to the defense. If they do disagree, so the tutors disagree about the grade and it's more than 1 point in difference, then a third reader is needed again. The third reader then decides a grade between those two grades. So it's not lower than the lowest of the two, and it's not higher than the highest of the two. And then again, this will be 6.5 or higher. So you are asked, are you satisfied with the grade? So you can do the reset, or you can go to the defense again. Now, could also be the case, of course, that they do give you different grades in the sense that one gives an insufficient grade and the other gives a sufficient grade. In that case, there will always be a third reader needed. The third reader then decides, and they basically decide whether it is a sufficient thesis, so you get a 6, or it's insufficient, and then you have to do the reset, of course. And then again, if you have the 6, then you get this provisional grade, and you still can decide whether you do the reset or you go to the next step, and that is the defense. If you're satisfied with your provisional grade, you can make arrangements for your defense, and there is a deadline for that. So that's the end of January and the end of August for the different semesters. You have to find a date and a time that the supervisor, second reader, and you are able to do the defense. What you have to do then is to present your thesis briefly in 5 to 10 minutes, and then you get at least 30 minutes of questions from your supervisor and the second reader. So that's basically what happens. And then after the defense, that is step 8. Then usually, if you have family and friends, then you and your family and friends are asked to leave the room, and then the tutors decide on the grade. Now, if your defense was excellent, you can get half a point extra. So if you have a 7.5 as your provisional grade, this can become an 8. It cannot become a 6. So it's not, or a 7. So it's not that you can get a lower grade than the provisional grade you already got. So you will pass this course, this master thesis. Do not automatically expect that you get this 0.5 extra point. It only happens in exceptional cases. These days it looks like students are already counting on that they get this half point extra. Don't do that. It is really for exceptional cases only. Yeah. After that, the supervisor fills in the joint assessment form in consultation with the second reader and sends that to the master thesis email address, and then the coordinator sends the grade to the administration. You will get the joint assessment, and you will also get a joint assessment earlier than this one. So when the supervisor and the second reader have decided on your provisional grade of and maybe the third reader, they will send you, or you will get the this provisional grade together with this preliminary joint assessment. On the final joint assessment, there will be something about the defense as well, some assessment of the defense as well. Now, what if you want to do a reset or have to do a reset? Then you will have this joint assessment form, and that basically contains remarks from your supervisor and the second reader on the strong points, and also obviously then the weak points of your thesis, and you can use the remarks about weak points to try and improve your thesis. You have 2 weeks for that. Then there is a deadline for handing in the reset. If you do this before the deadline, then the same procedure follows, obviously. Hopefully, if you had an insufficient grade, you now have a sufficient grade and you pass, or if you try to improve your thesis from a sufficient grade to a higher grade, you have the higher grade, and then you get that grade, of course. You could also still fail. Then we have 2 options. The first option then is to do a 3-month revision. Based on the joint assessment form, you try to improve your thesis, take 3 months for that, and then you hand it in. During those 3 months, you get there's only one time you get feedback from your supervisor. So that is basically to make sure that the amount of supervision that each student gets is by and large the same. So you get only one meeting, one feedback meeting from your supervisor. If you then fail, it's end of story. You have to do an entirely new thesis, which of course also is something you could do immediately after failing the reset. You don't go for the 3-month revision. Sometimes that would be the advice of a supervisor. Don't go for the 3-month revision, because I do not think that 3 months will 3 months working on this thesis will actually improve the thesis, and then it's just 3 months is a waste of time. So then you can write a new thesis if you want to. So that would be the second option, of course, if you fail the reset. So that's a lot. So there are a lot of procedures, a lot of rules, a lot of deadlines, stuff like that. Of course, there are many ways in which things can go wrong. We're here to help. So Shinta, so she's the education coordinator. So if you have problems with planning, if you get ill, stuff like that, you might report it to her and talk to her. If you have problems finding a subject, a topic for your thesis, or a supervisor or stuff like that, or want to talk about whether you're on the right track, you have to go to Michael or me. So Michael in the second semester of an academic year, and to me in the first semester of an academic year. If you want to make exceptions, if you want deadlines for the actual thesis to be, say, postponed, so that is for, say, the go no go moment, the deadline of handing in the thesis, you will always have to ask the examination committee. So your supervisor cannot decide, well, it's okay to hand in your thesis 3 months later because whatever reason it is. If that's the case, you might also talk to Shinta first. She might help you if there are personal reasons that you don't need to disclose to us, to the lecturers. You could ask her to help you write a letter to the examination committee, for instance, to ask for a postponement of the deadlines of the thesis. Exceptions with respect to the Master Thesis Track, to this course or any other course, you have to ask the deadline officer. So also, it's not your lecturer, not the supervisor, not the teacher that is allowed to do that. You ask the deadline officer, and that is Stefan Blanke.
In the next section, I will tell something about the deadlines for many of the documents and meetings, etc., that there are in this entire procedure. This is quite general, but on Canvas there will be a document with all the precise dates.
Right, so let's take a look at what you all need to do. So it depends on whether you start in block 2 or block 4. So the next slide will be about block 4, but I will be brief there. So I'll explain it here in a little bit more detail. So first of all, you need to fill out a preference form for the supervisor you want. What you do is you tell us basically who you want to have as a supervisor and on which topic. You have to be brief there. The form will be pretty self-explanatory. And then we decide who supervises which thesis. So we can only guarantee you that you have a supervisor, not that you have the supervisor you want, and also you might not. We'll try to accommodate you with the topics, but it might not always be the topic you want. Then you have 3 seminars in which you can ask questions and in which you can ask things for clarification, maybe address problems you have, things that are not clear. Basically what you then have to do is to do 2 types of exam. That is a summary assignment that has a strict deadline, and the thesis registration form. You have to hand that in, and that's a strict deadline. More about the thesis registration form in a moment. Because those are part of the exam of the Master Thesis Track course, you have a reset for that, and they have deadlines for that. So that's basically what you have to do in block 2. And you see with elements all have deadlines. Now, then we go to the next semester, the semester in which you actually write your thesis. First of all, you start with a go, no-go meeting. So you probably have started writing your thesis a little bit earlier than this semester. And then you hand in something on which your supervisor bases their assessment for the go, no-go meeting. Make sure that you make an arrangement with your supervisor prior to the deadline of Friday. That is the deadline for the form, so not for the talk. So the form has to be handed in on Friday and not just the talk and then the form later. It is the deadline for the form. Then the next thing you need to do is, of course, to write the thesis, but then after that you have to hand it in. There is a deadline for that. It's a strict deadline. If you miss it, you automatically go to the resit. Then what we have is 8 working days to assess. That is, we have 10, but we use 8 working days to assess the thesis. That is, the supervisor and the second reader assess the thesis. and they establish a preliminary mark which they communicate to the coordinator. Then the coordinator can see whether a third reader is needed. If not, that's good. If it's needed, then the coordinator make arrangements for that, and then 2 working days later, and that makes 10 working days we have for assessment for thesis, is the assessment of the third reader has to be in, and then the grade will be communicated to the student via Canvas. That is what we do. So all the grades will be on Canvas, and then the coordinator publishes those grades for all students at the same time. Now, if you want or have to do a resit, the procedure is the same. Basically, there is a deadline. That's a strict deadline. If you had it in before the deadline, we get 8 days for the supervisor and the second reader to assess the thesis, send the grade to the coordinator, and then they look at whether a third reader is needed or not. Then for that semester, that is also the end of the academic year, you have the 31st of August, that is the deadline for the defense, and that's a strict deadline. Basically, the idea is if you miss that deadline, you have to pay money to enroll in the next semester. So make sure that you make arrangements before the 31st of August. If you start in block 4, the schedule is basically the same. The dates are a little different, so you'll find them posted on Canvas. Of course, the deadline has to be before the 31st of January then. But basically the entire procedure is the same, of course. Let me reiterate that if you need a postponement of a deadline because you have a very good reason, you cannot get them for a supervisor. Of course, if you agree on a schedule for when you hand in chapter 1 and when you hand in chapter 2 and stuff like that, and you don't meet that, of course your supervisor can make arrangements with you for handing in chapter 1 at a later date. But when they are part of the exam, this has to go to the extension officer for this course, or the examination board for the thesis. So make sure that you follow the right procedures to do that, because otherwise you might fail this course, or you might fail the exam for the thesis, or you might fail the thesis. So we want to be fair. We want to have all the students to have the same amount of supervision. There could be a really good reason if you get really ill or something like that. So not just the flu for a week, but really ill and you're not able to work on a thesis for several weeks, then of course we might take a look at whether we could accommodate you with some additional weeks. But of course, these exceptions have to be made in an official way. So you cannot just make an agreement with your supervisor.
Let us now take a brief look at how a thesis is assessed by the supervisor and the second reader.
Both the supervisor and the second reader, and if need be a third reader, fill out an individual assessment form. And you can find one on Canvas as well. And there's a template that the supervisor and the second and third reader can use. First, there are several criteria that you have to meet. If you don't meet these criteria, if your thesis doesn't meet these criteria, then your thesis will not be graded. That sounds harsh, but you need to meet some criteria. So make sure that all your personal details are on the thesis, that the thesis details are on there, and that your thesis has the right amount of words. So usually, unless you started quite some time ago, the length of the thesis is 15,000 words. plus or minus 10%. So if you have 12,000 words, then that's not enough. If you have 20,000 words, that's too much. In both cases, your thesis will not be graded. Also, you should use a coherent and consistent reference style. APA is very common. That's usually for the more analytic thesis. Chicago style is a style that's in many cases used by the more continental thesis, but at least you need to follow the rules of one style of citation and referencing. You need to upload it to the plagiarism scan. If you follow procedure, then automatically a plagiarism report is present, and your supervisor and second reader will look at that and they can tick this box. So make sure that all the data are on the slide. So the name of the university and the department, and also so the track you're doing, right? So whether you do EBO or PMP or something like that. So the program needs to be there as well. So sometimes students forget that. Okay, so let's take a look at the actual assessment criteria. So of course you need to formulate a problem. You can look at the descriptions, what the supervisor and the tutor then look at. If anything, the problem should be on your thesis registration form. So if you haven't made radical changes along the way, then this should be at least sufficient. So what the supervisor and the second reader will do, they will say it's good or it's sufficient. So they will usually not give a grade, but they could give a grade as well if they want to. But there is no weighing of all these different elements of one, the formulation, two, the theory and literature, three, the method, and the other ones that are on the next slides. So we have a holistic way of grading. Of course, it could not be the case that you have an insufficient for all these elements and then the thesis is very good. Obviously, that's not the case. So, but in different styles in philosophy, different traditions in philosophy, different elements are more important in one style than in the other. So that's why we don't have a weight for all these different elements. So you need, of course, to have a problem that's formulated properly. You have to use relevant literature. Of course, that is something you discuss with your supervisor prior to your start, and along the way you might also get some tips. Maybe read this, maybe read that. And make sure that they are all in the list. Explain everything correctly, so that's why we also have the summary assignment, so that you can summarize, you can explain what the different philosophers are saying. Of course, you have to be quite critical to your to what you're writing, not just agreeing with anything. Then there is the method. Is the method chosen clear? Is it adequate? Is the argumentative strategy justified? Make sure you debate this also before you start with your supervisor. These are things that should be sufficient because you already talked about them prior to the start of you writing your thesis. The results, of course, you have sub-questions usually. Are they answered correctly? Is it clear how they contribute to answering the main research question? Have you looked at objections? So that is something that sometimes is a bit problematic. So make sure that you look at possible objections that could be raised to your view. And of course, you need to conclude and discuss properly. So your conclusion has to follow logically from what you have written, what you've written, and then what is usually a good idea is to see whether there is still something to be researched. Obviously, you cannot write everything you want about a topic. Those topics are usually too broad for the 15,000 words, so you have to keep it limited, and then you say, well, this is an important issue, but due to lack of words, I cannot discuss this now. And then in your further research, you could say, well, we saw this and this, and of course, we want to do some more research into that topic that we just put aside for the moment. Make sure you have a very good structure. This is something you could discuss before you start writing your thesis. Make sure that your supervisor and you are in agreement on what you are going to do in chapter 1, in chapter 2, in chapter 3, etc., and how they relate to each other. If you make a very good plan on the thesis registration form already, then and you make also sure that you know how many words you have then for chapter 2 and how many for chapter 3 and how many for chapter 4, then you also will have a balanced thesis. So that might be a good thing to discuss with your supervisor prior to start writing. And then the structure of the thesis and the question whether it's well balanced will be here. Well, you will get a good grade here or a good assessment here. Sometimes students start writing if they don't have a proper plan. Just in chapter 1 I'm going to do this, in chapter 2 I'm going to do this, in chapter 3 I'm going to do this. You might run the risk that you use too many words for chapter 1, and then you have either the problem that you later have to rewrite it to get some words for the other chapters, or you keep the long chapter 1, but then you have a very big chapter 1 and very small chapters 2 and 3. So then it's not a balanced thesis. So make sure that if you say, well, I have 3,000 words for all the chapters, for each chapter, if you say I have 5 chapters, make sure you stick to those, to that amount of words. Then, of course, try to be original. That is very difficult, but it is an assessment criterion. But it's, of course, very difficult to be original. Of course, you need to take a look at your language, your style. You have to choose a reference and quotation style. Did you follow the rules correctly? If not, of course, if it's really bad, then the thesis will not be assessed anyway. But you could also have followed the rules not very coherently every time. So make sure that the layout is nice and neat, that it's coherent through the thesis. Don't use underscore ever in a thesis. For instance, if you're looking at the layout, don't underscore words or titles or things like that. Okay, so what happens if you look at the final assessment? Then the supervisor or the second reader or the third reader fills out the final assessment in words and then gives a mark. And then after the supervisor and second reader discussed their individual assessments and possibly with the third reader, then the provisional grade is put on the individual assessment form of the supervisor, and then all the individual assessment forms are sent by the supervisor to the master thesis email address. Basically, that's Michael and me. Then we look at that, and then if we put it in our archives, we can later see that if for instance, it's the case that the supervisor gives a 7 and the second reader gives an 8, then you might say, well, they agreed on a 7.5, but not necessarily so. They could agree on a 7. And if then after the defense on the joint assessment form there's a 7.5, we don't know whether you got an extra half point or whether you already got a 7.5 as your provisional grade. So if they put a provisional grade here and say it's a 7, then we can see that on the joint assessment form there needs to be an justification of the additional half point that you got for the defense. So that's why on this individual assessment form of the supervisor there's room for the provisional grade. Now, then they send it to the email address of the master thesis. After your defense, the tutors fill out the joint assessment form, they sign it, and if you got half a point extra, there is room to give a justification for that. The rest of the criteria are the same, and this is sent to the master thesis email address and to you. You are allowed to see the joint assessment form. So you do not get a copy of the individual assessment forms, but you do get one of the joint assessment form.
Let us now look at the thesis registration form, because that is the final goal of this course, handing in a signed thesis registration form.
Filling out the thesis registration form will usually not be a problem once you have made a preliminary thesis plan, rework that on the basis of the feedback you got from Michael or me, and also later on from your supervisor. So then you can copy paste most of it into the thesis registration form. So you fill out your data here. Usually you will be writing a thesis for 12 EC, unless you started a couple of years ago, but that will not apply to many students anymore. But do tick that box, especially when it's different, right? Now you can copy paste probably most of the content of your preliminary thesis plan into the thesis registration form. You have a working title that can change, of course. The research question, make sure that if you change that on a later date, that both the supervisor and the second reader agree on that, so that you don't change the topic and that the second reader later gets the thesis and says, well, this was not what I signed off on. What is good is to have a very clear structure, not just first I'm going to do this and then that and then that and then that, but make a structure for each chapter. Well, just use this form also to write down some literature. Obviously, you're going to do research, and that means that you will find some other literature along the way. What is a good idea is that if you have, say, 4 chapters, that for each chapter you have some literature, that it's not the case that once you start writing that you say, well, I don't have anything for chapter 2, where do I find it? And that it might be difficult to find that literature. So make sure that you have enough to start with for each chapter. About the timing, that differs a little bit from supervisor to supervisor. Some say, okay, we meet whenever you hand in a chapter. Others give you a very strict schedule for chapter 1 is due on that date, chapter 2 on that, and chapter 3 on that date, and then closely after that you will have a meeting with your supervisor to discuss the feedback that you, of course, got then by then. Okay, so the deadline for everyone is the same, of course, and you have to sign it, the supervisor has to sign it, and the second reader has to agree, so has to sign it as well. Now, on the last page, you'll also find some indication of how you could divide your hours that you get basically for writing a thesis. So you see meetings with supervisor, 10 hours. That means the meetings you have for discussing the feedback, but also if you have a question and you need to meet with your supervisor, that also falls under that, right? So it could be that the feedback sessions are a little less because you've also talked about what to do in the next chapter, for instance, with your supervisor.
In the next section, I'll explain how we've set up the allocation of supervisors, so how you find a supervisor, and also give you some pointers with respect to finding a topic to write about.
What you need to do is to fill out the supervisor preference form. What you do there is you fill out the supervisor you prefer to supervise your thesis and the topic. And then you do that as well with a second preference and a third preference. Now, it might not be easy to come up with a topic and to think about who could supervise that. So we try to help you out a little bit with that. So there is information you can find on Canvas. It contains a document, for instance, with research expertise of the different lecturers that can supervise a thesis. You can look at that. Of course, you have had some courses if you did a pre-master and enrolled in the master, so you probably know some supervisors. If you did a bachelor at Tilburg University, you probably know most of them. So if you did a bachelor, it might be a little bit easier to come up with a topic and preference for a supervisor. So we have put some information on Canvas if you are still not sure about what you want to write about. So you can find it on Canvas. On Canvas there are also posters. We also have posters of all the lecturers that might be able to supervise a thesis. So on these posters are also different things than they might have put in their research expertise. So they might be interested in topics they do not really do research on, but might be willing to supervise a thesis on. So take a look at the posters as well to see what the different lecturers are interested in and might be able to supervise a thesis on. So take a look at that. The posters are also in the hallway of our department. Now, supervisors have a limited amount of time. We're only human. So a couple of years ago, we come up with this idea that supervisors can only supervise at a maximum of 7 theses each academic year. So that means the bachelor and the master together, and that for an entire year. Also, most of the lecturers do not have 7 places each year, just because they also have to do other things, and if someone has a grant for research, then they usually have to do more research, and that means less supervision of thesis. So there might even be lecturers that don't supervise any thesis at all in a given year. So the implication for you is that you might not get the supervisor you want. Also, if a supervisor is very popular, for instance, Ruud is very popular, if he has 10 students that want him to supervise their thesis. That's just not possible. So you might not get the supervisor you want. Also, that also means that if you want to write on a very specific topic that only one supervisor can supervise, you might also not be able to write on that topic. So it might be a good idea, if you already know that you don't say the first supervisor is person X and this is the topic, and the second preference, or my second preference for a supervisor is supervisor person Y, but it's the same topic. If you already know that no one is able, other than supervisor X is able to supervise the topic, then write down another topic. So you can at least write about something you are interested in. So we can only guarantee you that you can get a supervisor for your thesis, not that you can write on the topic you prefer or under the supervision of the person you'd like. That's just because we only have limited amounts of time. Yes, so in looking for a topic, do not come up with a topic that no one has an expertise in. So if you come up and also come up with, you have to come up, of course, with topics that are relevant to philosophy. So don't come up with very esoteric topics that or topics that belong in another discipline, because then there's no one who is capable of supervising that. Now, what happens is the following. You fill out the supervisor preference form, do that in the week you are supposed to do that, because immediately after that we try to make the puzzle of who supervises which thesis, and we try to get back in touch with you as soon as possible. Also, this means that supervisors are not supposed to promise that they will supervise your thesis. So please also don't put them in a position that you ask them to. Just fill out the supervisor preference form and then we'll take it from there. A supervisor, of course, can say that they're interested in supervising your thesis or that your topic is interested, but do not take that as a promise that they will do that, because they are not allowed to do so. Just because then the more bold students might end up with the supervisors they prefer, and the students that are a bit more shy might not ever get the supervisors they want. So fill out the form and then we'll just take a look at the topics, see how many students want supervisor X, and see whether supervisor X can do all these theses or that we have to make different arrangements for some of those students. It might not be easy to come up with a topic. For those students, I have a special project that is a project in which I am the supervisor, and the project is about miscarriages of justice. So then you write a thesis on this topic. That's a very broad topic, but I think it is interesting to many students. That's why I chose this, and also because I have some expertise in it, of course. And then you can write about this. I made an entire clip about what we'll do in this project and how we go about writing a thesis. Look at that if you are not sure what you want to write about, and this might be a topic that interests you. So take a look at it, and it might be helpful, and maybe you do want to write about this, and then just put miscarriage of justice in the supervisor preference list as the topic of your first preference.
That's it for now. Stay safe.